Okay, hello everyone. We are going to start off our very first lecture of the course on dating. This is an issue that comes up quite often when you first start to study history, where you've got all these different dating styles. Um, we are primarily going to be dealing with BC AD and BCE CE in this course, although I will have to say, when you start reading through your articles, you will come up and with different dating styles. And I'll try and go through that as we get to these articles. But let me see if I can get this pencil to work. Hold on. Okay, so the first one I want to look at is the difference between BC, AD, BCE, CE. So I'm sure you've probably heard this. BC stands for before Christ. So that's before the year zero, which, by the way, there was not a year zero, but that's how it's usually calculated. So 10 BC is 10 years before Christ, before the birth of Christ. Now, some scholars use BCE, which is before Common Era, and that is the exact same date as BC. So 10 BC, 10 years before the birth of Christ, is 10 BCE, before Common Era, because they also start at the year zero. That goes to above the year zero, which is AD or CE. So AD means Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. So AD 10 or 10 AD is 10 years after the birth of Christ. And now this also corresponds to CE, which is Common Era, which is exactly the same. So 10 BC, 10 AD is equivalent to 10 CE, Common Era. So I just give you a few more examples here. You will also start to see in some of the articles I give you a dating system where it says like 5900 BC Cal. So what that means is it's calculated from this particular calendar year, this one right now. So 5900 BC Cal is 5900 BC or 5900 BCE. Now, the reason I bring this up is because sometimes you will see carbon dating, and that's based off the year 1950, and then you have to do a little calculation in your head. But if that starts showing up in the articles, I will do a little explanation of carbon dating. Okay, let's get to the good stuff. So we looked at this question in last week in one of the lectures. So what are the sources for Roman Republic history? There are quite a few after a certain period. So I mentioned there's no written sources before 600 BC. And we will look at this next week when I start looking at sort of the mythical stories of the founding of Rome versus archaeology. But anyway, right now there's no written sources. We start to see some, in the middle of the 200s BC. And I had mentioned this last week, that sometimes what you can see is a writer like Livy. He will write and he will mention someone who wrote 2 centuries before him. So we've got some fragments. Unfortunately, we don't have any continuous histories that go back to the earliest history of the Roman Republic. We do have papyri, wooden tablets, that show up every once in a while. It has to be a very particular way of preserving these because wood doesn't last. It's a natural source, and it likes to rot and fall apart and so on. And it's the same thing with papyrus. So if you're familiar with Egyptian history, papyri can last in the dry desert, which is why we have quite a bit of it, but it has to be preserved in a very certain way to make it to us. We do have inscriptions, which are carved usually in stone, not always, but those are the ones we usually have. We also have graffiti, which is either painted on a wall or written on a wall. We'll look at quite a few of these examples for Pompeii. There's some pretty amazing things coming out of there. Coins can also tell us a bit of history of the certain time periods when they're being minted. I mentioned this last week. You can also look at a coin in terms of the specific metal that it's made out of. And you can do lots of research just on that metal. You can sometimes even pinpoint where that particular metal came from. And then, of course, we have archaeology. And this is what we'll be relying on mostly for the early periods, even before the Roman Republic. And we'll go through some of those dates in just. Okay, I have a lot of information on this particular slide, and I do not want you to write all this down and memorize all these dates. I don't think that's really totally important. I mean, it's good to know when we're talking about, so if I start talking about the Neolithic period, it's probably good to know the general time frame of the Neolithic period in Italy. But yeah, please don't memorize these particular dates. But I do want to look at these. So Neolithic, let me get my little pen going again. So when usually words are broken down and you can kind of figure out what they mean by looking at their bits and pieces. So neo means new and lithic means stone. So the Neolithic is the new Stone Age. And it's kind of a misnomer, really, because the Neolithic is probably one of the most important time periods in human history, and it's where people start using agriculture. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. The Chalcolithic is the Copper period, and that these are really named for when people discovered the use of metals for various things. Like the Copper period, we have the Bronze Age, where bronze starts showing up, and that's a mix of tin and copper. We have iron start to show up in Italy around 900 BC. I mean, it's always hard to kind of guess, and that's what the little twiddle is. It's about 900 BC. Then we have the glacial period or the glacial culture that's around 900 BC to 800. And this is the time when we start getting more connections that we can see in the archaeology coming from this particular area. So you see connections with the Greeks. The Phoenicians are living, if you picture a map in your head, I probably should have put a map up here. It's where modern day Israel, Palestine is. That's where the Phoenicians are coming from. You also have connections with the Carthaginians who are in North Africa. And then I'll talk a little bit about the Etruscans and the Greeks who are also in. Okay, I just mentioned the Neolithic, and as I believe it's the most important time period in human history. It's when people discovered agriculture and domestication of animals. So, and this has an incredible impact on human culture because you get people settling down in one spot because if you're growing crops or if you've captured animals and you've built a little pen, you don't want to move away. So you want to stay there and you start learning about other plants and collections of seeds and how important it is to collect seeds and not eat all of your entire crop. So the Neolithic is very important during this time period. And before we start looking at the actual evidence of this, we want to know, how do we know all about the Neolithic? There's a number of different sort of research areas you can look at. So there's something called geomorphological. That's where you're looking at really the earth, how ground looks like over time and so on. We've got paleobotanical studies. These are really the study of plants before humans. So you can look at this in the pre-Neolithic period to see what was actually there. So for example, we know that humans in Italy were growing wheat during the Neolithic. Where did they get wheat from? If you look at the paleobotanical studies, you'll see that wheat was naturally growing as a wild plant in Italy, and somehow humans discovered its use. You've got archaeobotanical studies. That's looking at plants during the time period where humans are around. So we know that the Neolithic people were growing wheat, and we know that because of the remains of wheat in a lot of areas where they were using it. We've got paleontological studies that is looking at fossils. Now, we're not going to look back that far into Italian history. And then we've got sedimentological studies where you're looking at, which is very similar to geomorphological studies, where you're looking at the different layers of the earth and what people are doing with that. And I've given you an article here, which is not required reading for the class, but if you want to read more about all of these studies, you can go to this article and find this in the library. Okay, in terms of the Neolithic, so probably one of the most famous Neolithic sites in Italy is Tavolieri. And I give, you can see the little arrow where it's kind of pointing to, it's kind of this river area. Let me get my little pen out. It's kind of in this area. And it's pretty incredible. One of the articles I have you read shows a map of this area showing hundreds and hundreds of Neolithic sites here. In fact, we know there are over 1,000 sites here. What's really interesting is that many of these places were surrounded by ditches. There's been quite a bit done in the research of these ditches, and I have you read one of the articles there. In some cases, it's thought that they were probably just a ditch created when people were digging up the soil for other uses, for clay or whatever. In other cases, it's almost certainly defense. So I'll show you a slide in just a bit, but sometimes you see sites that look like this, where you've got a circular area of a ditch, and then you've got another ditch, and then you have all these huts where people were living. And so these ditches are actually pretty interesting if you look at them. There's other items we can find in these sites that tell us quite a bit about sort of life during the Neolithic. So you've got stone grinders. Now, we know that they're growing grain because we've done studies on the remains. So what usually happens is you take dirt from a site, you sift it, and then sometimes you float. You put the dirt in water, and sometimes the seeds will float to the top, and then you do microscopic studies on the seeds, and it turns out a lot of it is wheat and barley. And so we've got these metal stone containers where someone takes a grinder and grinds these up, and then you make your bread. We also have some interesting things that are found in this site that don't come from here. And this is obsidian knives. So obsidian is a very hard, sharp stone that's very popular when you chip it, and it creates a very sharp edge. These are coming from other areas, and it makes you think about trade. So they were probably trading, maybe they were trading their grain that they were growing for these obsidian knives or whatever, we're not quite sure. We have flint tools. So flint is another fairly hard stone, but it breaks on a very sharp edge. And then we have pottery. I'll show you some examples of pottery from this area. So they're growing grain, they're growing food, and you need something to store it in. So they have made, and this is just an image from one of the articles I've had you read, which is the new data on Neolithic ditches of the Tavolieri area. This is on page 14, but what you're looking at is an overhead shot from probably by plane or even a satellite these days, that's looking down. And what you can see, this is like an agricultural area. And these lines here are showing up on the satellite, and they look like they're man-made. In fact, they are man-made. These are the ditches. And again, in a lot of cases, this might have been where people were digging out clay from a certain area and left a ditch, or these are protective areas where people are actually living inside this area because the ditch will give them some protection from raiders or whatever it is. Here's another image from that exact same article that I was just talking about. This is showing images of Neolithic pottery. And what's kind of really amazing about this particular pottery is of course, that we have it, but if you look at, there's all these little marks on some of the pottery, like you can see them here. These are actually, this one here are fingernail marks. So whoever made the pottery decided to decorate it with their fingernail. And these could be little fingerprint marks and so on. So you get a little bit of decoration from someone who is making the pottery. And I just have one more slide. I think on the Neolithic, it's one of my favorite periods to kind of talk about. Um, Now, I mentioned in the previous slide that you can find flint knives. So of course you're going to find places where flint is being taken from, and these are the mines. Not really mines as like what you think about, 1,000 feet deep. They're usually just, holes in the ground, and you can tell where people are chipping off various bits. You will find ceramic production. I just showed you some pottery. I talked about trade networks. So it tells you a little bit about the economy, and you should start thinking about the social classes, because who's got the wealth that can trade for, say, an obsidian mine? This would be a farmer that might have excess crops. Um, you do see seashells in places, volcanic glass that might have been used for various wealth. When you look at the remains of some of these sites, you can look at the bones that are left over and do genetic testing and discover that they're coming from sheep. They had cattle, they had goats. I already mentioned the grinding stone sickles, at least for the handle, or at least for the blade we have. That's where they're going out and they're cutting, say, the wheat um, that they're growing, plus barley. I already mentioned that. And we know that people ate both of these. So there's some really fascinating studies on teeth where you can take a cross section of a tooth, do some chemical studies, and discover whether people are eating plant material primarily or meat. And sometimes they can even tell what type of meat it is or grain based on the leftovers on the teeth. And just a reminder here to make sure you read the other article, The Beginning of the Neolithic Era in Central Italy, because it's got some pretty fascinating stuff. Okay, I'm not going to say too much about the copper period. I'll show you a slide here in just a second, but it's probably just a continuation of the people who are living there. There's no difference. So it just so happens that during the Neolithic, people discover metalworking. So copper is a very soft metal. It's easy to maneuver, easy to produce. You can kind of just pull it out and knock it. So it makes sheets. It can have weapon use, um, and a lot of this is coming from the northern part of Italy, and this will become really important when we start talking about the Etruscans, because much later than this period, you've got a group of people called the Etruscans, and they controlled a lot of the metals that were up in this particular area. And here's one example of a copper axe, or probably a copper hammer. Again, copper is fairly soft, but once they discovered it, they made great use of these particular metals. I thought I'd show you this really interesting shot of some of the jewelry that's being found. And what's really amazing is when you look at things like this. Now, sorry, I don't have a scale on here for you, but this is fairly small. You can see the drill hole here. So they clearly had some type of technology that allowed them to drill holes. And undoubtedly, this is a necklace. This is right full of little holes. So someone had the technology and the time to sit and create something like this. And now we move into the next metal age, which is the Bronze Age. And it's a fairly long time period. It's over 1,000 years in Italy. And I just mentioned a little bit ago that to make bronze, you need tin plus copper. And those mixed together make a much harder metal. And so it's usually referred to as the Bronze Age. And then, of course, as you can see from the slide, they've got an early Bronze Age, middle, late. It just depends on, what you really want to focus on. For our purposes, it's not all that important. What I really want to stress is you're starting to see almost like a progression in culture, where if you go back to the early Neolithic, they're living in these little round huts, which I didn't show you, but if you read in your article or the two articles, you'll get descriptions of these. The houses become a little more advanced. You get more trade. So Mycenaean Greek, this is a culture that was going probably around 1800 BC, started to collapse around 1200 BC from Greece. And it was really a high point in Greek culture. People normally think of Athens and 400, 500 BC as the high point, but the Mycenaean period was between 800, 1800 and 1200 BC, another high point, and they were trading all around the Mediterranean. So you start to see Greek pottery in Italy. They're still using the same plants, wheat and barley. They're growing beans. They're taking acorns from trees, and you see kind of the same type of animals along with pigs. But if you kind of look at the archaeological record, you're getting fewer pigs for whatever reason. I'm not quite sure of the reason. And you still have pottery. And then you start to see at the late Bronze Age, down to about 900 BC, something called the Proto-Villanovan culture, which is proto just means early. Um, when you look at these particular sites and you look at the burial remains, there's cremation only, and that's the burning of the body. So it's not inhumation, which is burying the body. This is cremation. And no big surprise, you see bronze metalworking, especially with weapons and these beautiful bronze vessels that people are using to store various things. And I just mentioned this Villanovan culture. These are thought to be predecessors of the pre-people before the Etruscans. It isn't clear. Scholarship changes on this quite often. It's possible that the early Villanovans were really just the pre-Etruscans, so the same people living in the area. They're really known for their burial styles. So what you're looking here are something called well tombs, where they've dug down into the ground and they take the ashes of a person, so usually a male, though sometimes female, and then they put them in these urns, and they always have these little caps on them. You can see it on this one as well. They're actually pretty interesting. I'll have at least one or two to show you from the Etruscans who come after, who are doing essentially the same thing. And I just mentioned, kind of one of the reasons I want to go through this is you're showing kind of a progression in a culture. So by the time you get to the 700s, you're really moving into the early Etruscan period in northern Italy. So you don't have the Romans just yet. They are there. We'll talk about that next week when we look at the archaeology of Rome. So you do have a few houses or huts being built in Rome, but this is mostly in the northern part of Italy where you're seeing more settlements being built. So it means the population is growing, and that's a direct result of agriculture. So they've got more food, their population is going to grow. You start to see more on the sociology of people. So in men's graves, you're starting to see armor. And armor should tell you that they're probably fighting with people. You're seeing horse riding equipment, brooches, and so on, things that are related to, in this case, war. So they're starting to fight with other people who are living in the area. You do see women's graves, and I've listed a few things here that's being found in those. Necklaces, brooches, spindles, which is what you would make cloth out of. So they definitely had that particular technology. Again, what's interesting is when you think of a culture that's burying material, they must have a surplus or there's some type of wealth. So in the men's graves, they're burying metal armor. This is something that could be melted down and used again, but they've decided not to. Women have necklaces of glass, of amber. This is showing wealth in these particular communities. And then you can see in the later phases, there are definitely more wealth being buried. And you start to see a difference in burial where they're burying the body instead of doing cremation.